Ever come across that Aesop's fable? You know, the one where the fox is all like, those grapes are probably sour anyway.
Oh, yeah, classic.
It really makes you think, especially when we're diving into Surham's office epidemics and this whole concept of Blamerasis.
Definitely a workplace ailment we've probably all encountered at some point.
Totally. In fact, their example scenario at the beginning really brings it home.
Yeah, you're right. The one with the project review.
Yeah. So picture this. It's Friday afternoon. Everyone's mentally checked out, ready for the weekend.
In there.
And then Vikram, the project lead, suddenly decides he needs totally updated figures. Like, major spreadsheet overhaul, due Monday.
Oh, no, I can already sense the blame train coming.
Right. And wouldn't you know it, Ravi, the junior analyst, bless his heart, speaks up. He's like, we used the numbers you gave us a couple of days ago.
Setting the scene. Classic blame-shifting setup.
Totally. But here's where it gets really interesting, Vikram. Instead of just saying, okay, my bad, somehow manages to make it seem like Ravi and Lipriya, another team member, should, like, psychically known to double-check him.
Oh, wow. Talk about passing the buck.
Seriously. Suram even points out that Vikram has this sly grin as this is happening.
That little detail right there speaks volumes.
Totally. Like he's gotten away with something.
Exactly. It's textbook blame-er-RAY-sis getting that weird sense of accomplishment from pinning it on someone else.
It's like that saying, a bad workman always blames his tools.
Spot on. It's all about deflecting responsibility.
But seriously, why do people do this? Is it just like a power move? What's the psychology behind this whole Blamerasis thing?
You know, that's a question I had too. And Suram really dives into the why, and it's kind of fascinating.
Okay, hit me with it.
So it often boils down to fear, like deep down fear, not just of, say, missing a deadline, but of looking incompetent, damaging their career.
So it's like self-preservation, but in a really unhealthy way?
Exactly. It's like they see blame as the shield to protect their ego, their position.
And that makes sense, but it doesn't make it right, obviously.
Absolutely not. And what's worse, Suram talks about how sometimes this behavior comes from a lack of good leadership training. Like they were never taught how to own up to their mistakes gracefully.
Oh, interesting. So it's like a vicious cycle. Bad leadership breeds more bad leadership because no one learns how to take responsibility.
Precisely. They've never learned to say, hey, you know what, I messed up, and here's how we can fix it.
But it's not just about the Blameraser, right? Like, what about the people they're constantly throwing into the bus?
Right. Suram really drives home this whole idea of the human cost of Blamerasis. And in their example, you really feel for Priya.
Totally. Like, remember how they described her? Going from star performer to always guessing herself.
Yep. Totally afraid to be the next scapegoat. And you know, who can blame her? Constant blame shifting like that, it erodes your confidence.
Absolutely. And speaking of feeling blamed, poor Ravi, right? Pulled all those late nights just to get those figures together and then, boom.
Talk about a punch to the gut. It really gets to that resentment that Suram's talking about, doesn't it?
Big time.
And you know, one thing that stood out to me was how Suram highlights that for Ravi, it's not just about that one incident.
Yeah.
It's like this constant drip, drip, drip of blame that's starting to poison his whole outlook. He was so passionate about the work, and now it's like, is this even worth it?
It's like killing the love, you know?
Totally. And then we've got Nisha, the intern, fresh out of school, bright-eyed.
Talk about being thrown into the lion's den. I can't even imagine starting your career in that kind of environment.
Seriously. And Suram points out how she's already internalizing this stuff. Like, she's hesitant to speak up in meetings, afraid to take initiative.
Oh, man, that's the worst. Squashing creativity before it even has a chance to bloom.
It's like, why even bother trying if any tiny misstep is going to be blown out of proportion?
Exactly. And this is what gets me. We're not just talking about, like, hurt feelings or bruised egos here. It's Priya's career trajectory, Ravi's passion for his work, Nisha's potential being wasted, all because one person can't just say, oops, my bad.
And you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because when we talk about this Blamerasis thing, Suram argues that it can become like contagious, you know?
Oh, yeah, totally. Toxic work environment spreading through the whole team, the whole company even.
Exactly. It's like this fear-driven culture where everyone's so afraid of making a mistake that they're not taking risks, not innovating.
Which ultimately hurts everyone.
Right, 100%. You end up with stagnation, missed opportunities, good people jumping ship left and right. It's a recipe for disaster.
So knowing all of this, I got to ask, what can we actually do about it?
Because it feels like something you can't just ignore, you know?
Totally.
Well, the good news is Surin gives us some really practical tools. One thing that really stood out to me was this self-assessment they have. Those reflection questions were really eye-opening.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I was going to say those were great, whether you're like a manager trying to deal with this on your team or honestly, if you're worried you might be the blame eraser.
Absolutely, because we all have blind spots, right?
Totally.
And one thing Suram emphasizes is that this isn't about labeling people or pointing fingers.
Right. It's not like you're officially a blame eraser.
Exactly. It's about, like, taking stock of the situation.
Yeah, yeah. More like a diagnostic tool.
Exactly. And I love how they take it a step further and say, okay, based on your self-assessment, you're dealing with one of these three things: a perception, a problem, or a full-blown pain point.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for those categories
Yeah.
because it feels like more than just labels. It's like they're guiding us towards actual solutions.
Exactly.
So let's talk solutions. Perceptions, problems, pain points. Sounds kind of like a medical drama, but I'm here for it.
Yeah.
Where do we even start?
Well, Surin breaks it down really well, actually, starting with perceptions, which, based on the self-assessment, would be the less severe end of the spectrum. They suggest focusing on communication, maybe letting some smaller things slide.
So not every eye roll or snide comment requires a full intervention.
Exactly. Sometimes having a calm conversation, making sure everyone's on the same page, is enough to clear the air.
Okay, makes sense. But what if it's more than just a perception? Like, what if the blame shifting is becoming a regular thing?
Right, that's when we move into problem territory. And here's where Suram suggests being a bit more direct, setting those clear expectations from the get-go.
Like, hey, when things go wrong, here's how we handle it as a team. No finger pointing.
Exactly. Open and honest conversations. And maybe loop in a manager or HR if needed, just to keep things neutral.
Okay, so for those trickier situations where it's more ingrained, those pain points Soram talks about,
Yeah.
that's where the acceptee framework comes in. I'm really curious to unpack that a bit.
Right, right. Because this is where things can get a little more, well, delicate. So, accept. It stands for acknowledge, consider, communicate, evaluate, propose, take responsibility.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
It is, it is. But the idea is to approach this really tough conversation in a way that's structured and, importantly, empathetic.
So not just like, you're a blame shifter, stop it, but more like,
Hey, I've noticed this pattern and it's really impacting things. Starting with acknowledging that this is a thing might be a bit sensitive, and then consider, taking a moment to consider their perspective.
that's so key. It's not always about being right. It's about understanding where they're coming from, too.
Absolutely. And once you've done that, then it's communicate clearly but calmly, explaining how their actions are affecting you, the team, the work. Specific examples can be really helpful here.
Like, remember when I got blamed for that spreadsheet error, even though...
Yes. Because then it's not just a vague accusation. It's like, here's how this is actually playing out.
And after you've laid it all out there, that's the evaluate part.
Exactly. Take a beat, see how they respond. Are they defensive or are they actually listening, trying to understand?
Because that tells you a lot, right? Whether you're making any headway.
Totally. If they're just digging their heels in, it might be time to, like we said before, loop in someone else, a neutral third party.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say the conversation's going well. They're receptive to what you're saying. What's next?
That's where the propose comes in. Brainstorming solutions together. What can you both do to prevent this from happening again?
So it becomes less about placing blame and more about, like, problem solving as a team.
Exactly. And then lastly, take responsibility.
Even if you're the one who's been on the receiving end of the blame.
Yeah. It's about acknowledging, okay, maybe I could have communicated more clearly, or, maybe there are things I can do differently too.
That's such a good point. It shifts the focus from you versus me to we're in this together.
Exactly. It's about creating a more accountable and ultimately more supportive environment.
Love that. But as helpful as the acceptee framework sounds, Sunam does make it clear that sometimes those conversations, even done with the best intentions, they're just not enough.
Yeah, sometimes you need to escalate HR, higher management, someone who can step in and help mediate or, address the bigger systemic issues.
Which, let's be real, can be really daunting, especially if you're dealing with someone who's like higher up on the food chain.
It's true. It's not always easy. But I think what Suram really emphasizes is that you're not just advocating for yourself, you're advocating for a healthier work environment for everyone.
It's about shifting the whole culture from fear and blame to, like, growth and accountability, right? And speaking of accountability, I love that quote Suam shared. Leadership is not about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge.
Simon Sinek, so good. It really makes you think about leadership in a different light.
It totally does. It's not just about having the corner office. It's about creating a space where everyone feels safe, supported, empowered to do their best work.
Absolutely. Leading by example, fostering that kind of environment.
Yes. Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into Blamerasis. Big thanks to our expert for breaking down this all-too-common workplace epidemic.
It was my pleasure. Always happy to geek out about this stuff.
And to everyone listening, we hope this conversation has given you some food for thought, maybe even some tools to tackle Blamerasis if you encounter it out there in the wild. Remember, a little self-awareness and empathy can go a long way. Until next time, happy collaborating.